The skin and eyes of the non-humans were described as scaled like a snake's body, and the eyes had vertical slit pupils beneath dark protective lenses. Since April 9, 1983, I have witnesses and physical evidence that support that alleged presidential briefing paper shown to me at Kirtland Air Force Base, and I have been reporting about the hardest facts and evidence that I have been able to muster as an investigative reporter since then for television, for radio, and for books that I have done. Today, on April 29th, 2013, 30 years later, as a longtime TV producer and investigative reporter who produces the science and environment website, earthfiles.com, and also reports monthly for Premier Radio Network's broadcast of Coast to Coast AM in Los Angeles, I can, before you today, assert that the pressure of facts accumulated from military and intelligent eyewitnesses, from ranchers and pathologists, from pilots and astronauts, from fellow human experiencers in the UFO abduction syndrome, and from leaks by scientists and computer experts who have worked on back engineering extraterrestrial technologies extracted from non-human craft, there is no doubt that the United States government since World War II and the FDR and Truman administrations has known about the extraterrestrial interactions with Earth and that their policies of denial in the alleged interest of national security are still in effect. My greatest challenge as a journalist is to get on the record what I am told by military and intelligence agents and other eyewitnesses on the record. National security in what is supposed to be a democratic government of, for, and by the people is not served by lies and secrecy. Every American and the whole world deserves the truth about non-humans, past, present, and future, interacting with this planet. Thank you.
If I've done the time calculations correctly, we now have about 5 to 6 minutes for each of the 6 members of the committee to engage in questions with the panelists.
As is my custom as a co-chair, I will reserve my questions till the end. I've always done that in the Congress. If my questions have been asked by my colleagues, I will simply thank the witnesses.
Mr. Dolan, I have a question. I wrote it. Personal experience. Have you had personal experience in this regard?
I don't really know if any personal experience I've had is particularly noteworthy. On 2 occasions in my life, I saw what I think might be vaguely considered a UFO. Most interesting, many years ago with my son, who was a small boy, was holding his hand in a bright blue, perfectly blue sky. I saw an object that was quite unusual, brighter than anything I'd ever seen in the sky other than the sun. And he was very small. He watched me staring at this thing, silent and wondering, what happened to Dad? And I turned to reassure him for one moment, and I looked back literally 1 second later, and the thing was gone. I have no idea what it was. That's really never been my motivation for studying this. I fell into this topic about 20 years ago while doing dissertation work on U.S. national security, circa 1950, and just stumbled into the topic of UFOs, and I guess you could call it an obsession ever since.
So why do you think that there, I mean, I know it's opinion, so we get this. Why the steadfast silence and denial? What
I think the implications are vastly, very profound. If we try to rewind the clock 60 plus years back to the 1940s and just imagine, just pretend for the moment that it actually happened, because many of us, I think it did, that an event, say at Roswell, happened, or maybe elsewhere, or other types of grave violations of airspace were going on. You think back to the very post-World War II era, the world was in a state of just flat on its back, trying to get back. There were millions of homeless people around the world, people on the brink of starvation, the early Cold War. It was not a stable time, and one would have to assume the last thing any president would be interested in doing would be to say to the world, well, we have this other phenomenon here too. We don't know who these people are. We don't really know if they're friendly or hostile. How can you tell the world that you have this under control when you yourself don't really know the full implications of what this is? So I think the logical thing that would have been done, and in particular if anything was recovered, because this is key, if one of your top scientists or generals approaches you and says, sir, we've recovered this exotic technology that's not from our civilization, and if you tell the world you have it, now you've got the specter of the Soviet Union, it becomes very difficult not to share this technology. The United States did not want to share atomic technology in 1947. Clearly, why would they want to share something as exotic as ET technology or whatever?
Well, okay, but this is the 21st century now.
Right. So what I think what happened is simply that secrecy becomes secret, it becomes profitable, it develops its own reason to be. It develops its own kind of logic. And I also think that much of it has sort of gone away from formal government channels and seems to become increasingly privatized.
So, do I have time? Any more time? Okay. Okay. One more quick question, Mr. Cameron. 6 witnesses threatened. How were they threatened, and who threatened them?
I'll give you an example of a couple of the witnesses. One witness was a woman who was a steno for a military contractor who had been involved in discussions when it appears material was being moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Area 51. She was in on these meetings, and she had agreed to go on camera with George Knapp. After this story started to break in 1989, she was visited by 2 officers the same day she was going to go on camera, and they said, we just want to remind you, you have a security clearance, you're still under oath. We know that you and your daughter travel back and forth between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. There's a lot of desert out there. We would not want to have something happen in the desert. George Knapp told me personally, this woman is so scared that 20 years later she still will not talk about it. They had witnesses at Nellis Air Force Base, the golf instructor at Nellis Air Force Base, the golf pro, the guy who did the taxes for the generals. They had got to know all the generals and had been told the stories about the fact that the crafts were at Area 51. This is all for true. One of the key witnesses is a guy by the name of Alfred O'Donnell, who the Appropriations Committee at Congress actually tried to talk to this guy. He was one of the highest ranking people at Area 51. George Knapp had a number of witnesses, and he figured that he wanted to track down this Alfred O'Donnell. Figured if anybody knew if the Area 51 crash saucer stories were true, it would be Alfred O'Donnell. He got to know him, got to be sort of friends. And he said he basically stalked this guy because this guy would know, and basically went to the guy's house. He's an expert on nuclear weapons from 1947 on, wired a lot of the first nuclear weapons, and he was showing him test site photographs from the nuclear stuff, and then he closed the book. He said, you didn't come here to talk about that, did you? And George said, no, I didn't come here to talk about that. He said, you came here to talk about UFOs, didn't you? And George said, yeah, that's why I'd like to know about it. And he said, well, and George said it took 6 months to get this guy to talk. And the guy, bit by piece, he wasn't allowed to tape, he wasn't allowed to take notes. And in the end, he basically said, yes, it's true. Area 51, we have the saucers there. And George said, aren't you afraid that there would be, the story would get out? He said, no, we were afraid it would get out. He said, what do you mean? You had an alien that came all this way, you kept it captive? He said, we didn't know what to do with it. We couldn't communicate with it. That is one of the highest level guys at the Area 51 site, is still alive, and a man who knows the whole story.
Thank you. Ms. Kilpatrick.
A few things. Thank you very much for your testimony. Very, very good, very good. Mr. Freeman, you were going to answer or add something to what Congressman Woolsey said. I'll give you that opportunity for a minute of my time if you'd like.
Okay, I was going to recite 6 reasons for...
Probably can't do 6 in a minute. Give me a minute.
Oh, sure you can. You want to figure out how
Okay,
the
all right.
saucers work. You worry about the other guy figuring out how the saucers work. You worry about it if an announcement would be made that the younger generation would push for an earthling orientation if we're told the planet's being visited. No government, including ours, wants that. We have the problem of Pat Robertson saying all the UFO stuff is the work of the devil, and all the intelligent life in the universe is here on planet Earth. I take issue with that. Finally, we have 2 special things. If they're coming here, some people say it's going to upset our whole technology. They've got things that will get rid of the oil industry, the car industry, plane industry, economic chaos.
Reclaiming my time. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. Cameron, you mentioned that you are, and I'm assuming it's currently the president's, director of the president's UFO website. Are you currently that?
Yes.
And that means for President Obama?
No, I have I have a website that basically, my experience was I had a sighting, everybody was interested, but I basically wanted to find out who knew what was going on. I went up the chain of command, figured the president's the most powerful guy, this is one of the most important subjects, what does the president know? So what I've done, I have a website that accumulates all the stories of what the various presidents have said, rumored stories and sightings. That's what I've done. I have a site that deals with the presidents and the subject of UFOs.
Okay, so that's where I wanted you to explain that first of all. So then does any of the presidents, and what year did you establish that? When was that established, the website?
It goes back about 15 years.
Okay, so then the presidents there, the 3 or 4, President Clinton, President Bush 1 and 2.
I have the stories from all the presidents.
And do they acknowledge the website and have given you any support, or is it just like, ooh, you can't talk about it?
I've gotten no interaction with the White House. They have been on the site a few times, but
Okay.
no interaction.
So it's for information for people of the world to access.
For the public, because there's a lot of rumored stories, and I don't really say this is true, that's not true. There's a lot of rumored stories about various presidents who have seen UFOs, what they've said about UFOs, and basically I just put it down so everybody can look at it.
Okay, that's good information. We need that. Thank you, ma'am. It's always one woman that comes through for everything that we do, so we thank you for yours, a different point of view and all of that as well. What do you do with all that information? You've seen it, you've read it in the middle of a room and photographed and all of that. What do you do? I mean, everybody becomes, we got nuclear scientists and all of that at the table. Are you frustrated? I mean, what are we going to do with this? It's a world phenomena. You all know better than I. We're kind of neophytes here, except for the scientists here. What do you do with it? Things like we're doing today, and urge the Congress, since 1968, has not had a hearing to do something else about it in the Science Committee that they did some 40-plus years ago. Comment?
My beat has always been science, environment, and medicine, and it never changed. And it was getting into the animal mutilations and having the shock of law enforcement tell me that the perpetrators were creatures from outer space that was quite stunning. I did feel like I was Alice in Wonderland going through a mirror into a completely different reality than what we live in our 9-to-5 daily lives. I produced the documentary that had a large broadcast in Colorado and the surrounding states in 1980, May 25th, 1980, called A Strange Harvest. And after that, as a professional working as director of special projects at the CBS station, I went on to do astronaut training in Colorado, Martin Marietta, and 1,000 other subjects over the last 30-some years.
So you are documented. You are, obviously, people call on you, so you're verified. By the way, the couple of the documentaries that you mentioned, are they available for our committee to each of us?
Yes, all of my work is at my news website, earthfiles.com.
Okay.
It's always there, it's always available. I've done 4 books, several documentaries, of which 2 are
Which
there.
1 or 2 would you give us? We can't read 10.
A Strange Harvest.
Okay, I wrote that.
And Strange Harvest 1993.
What's that say?
And those are the videos. I would give you the books, too. That's an
Okay.
Alien Harvest, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1 and 2.
Okay.
And
But
Mysterious
if we
Life.
Googled your name, we'd see all of that, perhaps, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Earthfiles.com.
And the only reason I'm rushing, because 5 minutes goes quickly, I don't know if I'm out of time or...
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're waiting for an answer with the next witness.
I have 30 seconds, let me do 10 of
Okay.
those, because I just got a note, and I should have done it, so please forgive me.
I thought you'd yielded, I'm sorry.
It's my bad, excuse me. My bad is like okay. All right. I am honored today, as I've been working with Stephen Bassett to take on this assignment, been doing a lot of research, reading, video, preparation, and all of that. That's why I asked for you all, and I got to have something written to respond intelligently. But I'm honored today to have one of the leaders in our nation on this topic and many others, a spiritual man, a righteous man, who has witnessed from many generations of his own religion the truth in UFOs. I'm honored to present to you Minister Louis Farrakhan. Would you please stand and be recognized, sir? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Gravel.
With all due respect, let me correct, I pronounce it within my family, Gravel.
Gravel?
It's a French name.
Thank you.
I want to associate my thoughts with Chairman Bartlett when he made the statement that it's the height of human arrogance to think that we are the only sentient human beings in the galaxies of the world that can think. That's human arrogance at its worst. What I'm struck with the testimony of all four of you, and of course the readings that we had in preparing for this hearing, is the fact of secrecy itself. You know, why do we need this secrecy? And I'm asking this question to all four of you. What threats do you think exist to the national security that warrants this kind of security, this kind of an approach? Please.
I started to say before, I can see 6 reasons for our government and other governments to keep things classified. First, you want to figure out how they work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. And with the Cold War going on, if you do have wreckage and you want to figure out something, you're not going to want to tell your enemies. The second problem is, what if they figure out how they work before you do? You don't want them to know, you know, they know. Weapon, counter-weapon, counter-counter-weapon. We've been playing this game a long time. The third problem is, if there were an announcement, I say by highly trusted individuals, it's a little hard to find them around the planet, but my favorite odd couple is the Pope and the Queen. They're about the same age, or they were until recently anyway. If they were to make an announcement that indeed UFOs are visiting, the planet's being visited, what would happen? Church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, the stock market would go down. But I think based on 600 college lectures that the younger generation, which unlike me and probably you wasn't alive when there wasn't a space program. There was strong sentiment against space travel back not too many years ago. The younger generation would push for an Earthling orientation. Let's face it, from an alien viewpoint, we are all Earthlings, Terrans, as the science fiction writers would say. I know of no government on this planet that wants its people to owe their allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. As far as I can tell, nationalism is the only game in town. There are some religious problems, extremists who say we're the only intelligent life in the universe and their followers don't want any part of visitors from outer space. It can't be. The planet was created in 4004 BC instead of 4 billion in 4 BC. A final thing, I have 7 times heard of cases in which pilots were scrambled to chase UFOs. There was a regulation issued, shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so, when 7 pilots didn't come back. These were quiet discussions. These were not big public things. And if I've heard 7, there are a lot more cases like that. There were 200 fatal military plane crashes between 1951 and 56, including 5 where the pilots had over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. That's a pretty good pilot to survive that. Comes back to the United States, no MiGs, and his plane, as the New York Times said, disintegrated or disappeared. Two strange terms to use in this context. So no families were told anything about that. And it may come as, well, it won't come as a shock to you, but there were 166, Air Force guys on board reconnaissance planes that were tickling North Korea, Russia, and China right after the war. See how quickly the radar came on, what frequency it used, and all that sort of stuff. 166 wind up in planes that were shot down. Not one word in public about that. Families were not told until 2001, where a meeting was called and the medals were given out and an explanation was given. I say that only because a lot of people think, well, certainly they would have told the families, those 7 planes. So that's an area of concern, I think, to admit that we can't do anything about these guys. Powerlessness is not something that attracts people to government.
May I add
Please.
a very quick follow-up and not taking a lot of time? I talked earlier about why I think that the possession of certain radical technology would have initiated some of this secrecy. Also, I think the need to maintain some level of social control, not knowing what these other beings were, at least in the early years. But I think what happens is once a secret goes on for long enough, it becomes a real nightmare to kind of contain. I can only imagine the difficulty that President Obama would face if he were somehow to make this announcement. I mean, really, if he were if something were to force him to make an admission that yes, these UFOs apparently, at least some of them, are real. What does he then say at this press conference? I know what he'd like to say, which is, well, thanks everyone, I'm going on a vacation for about 6 months. Because there are a lot of follow-up questions that would be, frankly, very uncomfortable for him to deal with. I think one of the questions that most responsible journalists would want to ask is, how on earth were you guys able to keep this secret for over 60 years? How did you do it? And the implications for getting into that whole issue are a nightmare, because you're starting to deal with, has there been some level of control or over the mainstream major media, academic community? In fact, there are many off-the-shelf academic studies that show intelligence community influence over our major journalism and over our major academic communities. It's not a big secret. This is a long-standing relationship. But there would be some very deep questions to ask about that, about the nature of special access programs and unacknowledged special access programs, the primordial black budget. All of these would now become the target of citizen inquiry. And I believe firmly that an admission on this topic, in addition to all of the scientific and existential issues that it raises, also gets into just some nasty, concrete political issues that I don't think any presidential administration would want to have to deal with.
And I could add to
Please.
that, from leaked sources, military and intel that I have encountered in my career, there is a complexity that as you go deeper beyond lights in the sky craft, a government interest in back engineering technology. There is testimony from, for example, someone who had worked at Wright-Patterson in the medical department, who has told me, and this is a historic fact as far as I know, that on one of the first autopsies that were done from one of the crashes in Roswell in 1947, and that was not the beginning. We had been retrieving craft and bodies from at least 1941 in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. But in terms of Roswell, one of the bodies, when the surgeon took a scalpel to start a T or a Y section on the autopsy, the report was, this is not tissue. It was fabric. And that in 1947, our government was discovering that they weren't probably dealing with the prime intelligence that was behind the craft, that they were dealing with something that would fall into the area of androidism. Today we have drones that are overflying the world. Back in 1947, our government came to understand that some of the bodies that they were taking from these craft were not even biological tissue as we understand it. And then you combine that with a sentence that I read in the alleged briefing paper that I was shown at Kirtland Air Force Base in the OSI office, the quote which has never left my mind: "These extraterrestrial biological entities manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien," close quote. Then that suggests that the relationship between what is in the skies, on the ground, underground, and interacting with humans and animals and plant life on this planet, as one man working for the DIA in retirement told me, "Linda, we are convinced that the intelligence interacting with this planet has been here for more than 270 million years, predating the dinosaurs." If the size and the scope of this is that large, and if our government began to stumble onto these facts piece by piece in World War II and after, then I can understand why President Truman and Churchill and Eisenhower and that group of people would have said, let's wait 2 generations until we find out what we're dealing with. And what makes me nervous and what bothers me is why in 2013 is the policy of denial not only in effect, but the people that I am talking to on the phone have visits by somebody from the government saying, "You are not to talk to Linda Moulton Howe ever again." Something is very wrong in the underbelly of this country that I think is related directly to a policy of denial from World War II about the fact that extraterrestrial biological entities, to use our government's own phrase in its own alleged documents, are interacting with this planet, have been for centuries, and that there is an intimate relationship between what we are and what they made. And that might explain why there's no wholesale evidence anywhere that the non-humans want to kill humans. They want, it appears, from my point of view as an investigative reporter talking with so many people, that there is an ongoing research program about what is happening on this planet and the surface life on Earth.
How much time do I have left?
We're now running about 10 minutes late, Mr. Chair.
Pardon me?
Yes, I understand that time is slipping away. Several of my questions have been asked. I hope that that's true for the next 2 witnesses so that their question period may be shorter. Congressman Cook.
I would like to claim my 5 minutes, Chairman, if that's all right.
I'll give you 6.
I'd like to ask Grant Cameron, maybe the first question, and if the others have a comment, be very happy to take those too. And Mr. Cameron, take a minute, but the others maybe 10 seconds if they have something to add. I think you're the one that talked about 5 years of hearings for President Truman. And
Briefings, yes.
Yeah, and many, and well, I know that Mr. Dolan also mentioned this. I guess 16 different, did you say 16 different?
We figure between 16 and 20 briefings.
Okay, is it possible that the Truman administration was concerned at the time more about either the Soviet Union, which you did mention, I think, Mr. Dolan,
Yeah.
or Nazi Germany as a source of some of the unidentified flying maneuvers they were watching and reporting on and being very concerned about?
I think it's basically the minute they looked at the Roswell crash, if that was the first crash, they saw technology. It's classified. End of game. This is, you're not giving this to the Soviets, you're not giving it to the Chinese. This is our type of technology. On Thursday, I'll refer to a Canadian government document, 1950, where the Canadians went to the United States, talked to American officials, and one of the things that they were told is that mental phenomena was involved with the saucers. So there's a lot of technology here, and you just have to think, are you going to give the technology that you may hear this week at this session, are you going to give it to Al-Qaeda, are you going to give it to the Chinese? To me, it was simple that Truman and the people around Truman saw technology. We need this. This is unbelievable technology, and whoever gets this technology rules the world. We're not giving it away. It's classified. End of the story, and that's how it has started, and that's how it's been maintained.
Let me just add, sir, to answer your question relating to the Soviets and Nazis and so forth. In the early era of this, these types of questions were being asked. They absolutely were. The question is, because you have different levels of security, I mean, in the declassified documents that we have, really the top secret and above, we have very few of those. So the declassified documents that are available to citizens are of the level of secret and confidential and restricted. Lower levels, they're still important, but they're not typically, very few that are actually of top secret. And I think that this is significant because what has come to us are some lower level classified debates over the nature of these. And many of those did focus on, did the Soviets create a flying saucer with their cache of German scientists? Did we do this? In those documents, I have seen no significant evidence to point to the Soviets or our own German scientists.
Okay, before I invite maybe 15 seconds from both Mr. Friedman and Ms. Howe, could you also comment on the testimony here that hasn't really said a whole lot? It was mentioned briefly, but a whole lot about sightings before the 1940s, before the Second World War. I mean, I know you mentioned that there have been credible sightings for many, many years before, but we really don't get a whole lot of interest on the part of an administration until the 40s. Now, doesn't that add a little bit of question in terms of whether what we've just been talking about might have been a real concern for the number of hearings being held?
I can add one thing. What happened in July of 1945, we tested a bomb, White Sands, and then we dropped 2 in August on Japan. And I believe that that action, which was a nuclear event, became a focus to this intelligence, and therefore that's how the government became so intensely aware.
Yeah. Can I add?
Sure.
I've done the presidents. I spent a lot of time trying to find stories of UFOs back in history through presidents. It starts in Roosevelt's day. It ties into the atomic bomb. If you go through presidential history, presidents are watched very closely. All their records are kept. I can find nothing before Roosevelt. So this is tied into the atomic.
Okay, but you're not
age.
saying, Mr. Cameron, are you, or any of you saying that President Wilson would have never been interested in phenomena that might involve extraterrestrial?
I think that the difference is that we really only in our own society develop much of a capability of detecting them. I mean, in World War II, we get radar. So we develop electronic means of detection. We, for the first time ever, have a lot of people in the air. So I think in earlier times, it's not that this phenomenon didn't happen, but there were fewer stories and not really in front row center of our consciousness.
By the end of World War II, there were 3 things that told our visitors from out there that soon we'd be going out there, which would scare the heck out of them because we're such a primitive society. Atomic bombs, powerful rockets used to kill, not to deliver the mail, as some people said they would, and powerful radar, the beginning of the electronics revolution. The only place in the world in July 1947 where you could check out all 3 of those was southeastern New Mexico, which is where Roswell is.
I'm going to reclaim just the last 30 seconds if I can, too. And again, if you'll take just maybe a quick yes or no. In your views, is it possible that if there indeed is such thing as extraterrestrial unidentified flying objects, that they would be more likely to be artificial intelligence instead of normal intelligence, given timescales of travel nearest star, what, 2 to 3 light years away, for example?
I think artificial intelligence is an extremely valid hypothesis. I've entertained it for many years. I think they would be the product of an advanced. I mean, we're less than a generation away from having our computers talking to us and claiming possibly to be sentient themselves. This is what AI theorists, and they're all mainstream people. It's a very common belief. So I have to assume that some other civilization will have gotten to that point.
And a confirmed physicist working on ring lasers at Wright-Patterson told me in the 1990s that he had firsthand knowledge about the extraterrestrial story, and that he, as a physicist, in the work that he was doing, that they knew, meaning the people that are involved with studying the phenomena in the government, that we are dealing with technology so advanced that they literally can bend space, time, and move point to point through the universe. And that physicist from Wright-Patterson at a table used what is now a metaphor generally in this whole subject. He took the napkin on the lunch table and he put it and said, "Linda, this is what they do." And he put one point and he did like this. This is space-time, that we're dealing with technologies that can bend space-time and put the corner to the corner. And that is why Euclidean geometry and time as we know it on this planet have no relevance to the phenomena and the intelligence that we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Time does have some relevance for us, and we are running late. I think we should shoot for getting the next panel started around 11, which would be 15 minutes late. Give a little bit of time for a stretch and have 6 minutes for the final member of Congress to ask the questions.
There are two left, I'm sorry.
Well,
And
then
we'll
that'll
try to
be a
go quickly.
stretch.
Congresswoman Hooley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for all of you for testifying. Question. Has there been a decrease in the number of incidents that have happened, at least in this country? Or, because it seemed like this was talked about a lot, and there were a lot of sightings at sometime, whether it was over the, prairie states. But that seems, you don't read about it very much today.
That's the kicker. It's not a question of how much is going on, it's how much do we hear about it. I check most of my audiences at the end of my lecture, I don't have guts enough to do it at the beginning, and find that 10% of the attendees believe they've seen a flying saucer. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, is getting over 600 reports a month. You don't hear about most of those cases, where the public's grown accustomed, I guess, or the media is unwilling to get involved. How many UFO reporters do you know? And I know of 2 competent journalists who are really into UFOs. That's an awful small number, George Knapp being one.
And what about in other countries? Are they reported, or, is that?
I find sightings everywhere.
The sightings are very common, but what isn't uniform are proper distribution networks or reporting systems that are in place. So what we've developed here in the U.S. are a number of websites that collect reports, and as I mentioned earlier, my estimate is a rough one, but it's not less than 10,000 reports actually are written by people per year, 10,000 in North America, that's U.S. and Canada. Elsewhere in the world, there are obviously many sightings. They're increasing, they're not decreasing, because people are now having better capabilities of reporting these. One of the problems with less developed nations elsewhere in the world in years past is just, if you saw a UFO, who do you report it to? There was really no mechanisms to do it, and that's improving now. So now we're seeing reports out of China, India, Africa, and really around the world. But still, there aren't, there's not a lot of infrastructure among civilian groups, for example, who really would be the ones that publicize this, to get the word out. You have our YouTube channels and people doing this on their own. What really I think is needed is a kind of coordinated global kind of organizational effort, and hopefully we'll get that.
Another problem is language. I am constantly confronted with the issue that something happens in China or South America or a country that does not speak English, and I'm an American journalist trying to report so that an American audience can understand. And I have worked sometimes for an entire week just trying to find a reporter in China or someplace who could help me do a translation so that you could get closer to firsthand facts. And it is so difficult. We're on a planet and where communication is basically blocked, whether it is country to country or even neighborhood to neighborhood in China, because the syntactical differences in the language there are so overwhelming that a man I know who lives there, works there from England, who tries to help, you still have translation problems there within very short distances. And so you take that to this complex phenomena. I know for a fact, every month across my desk and in my computer world, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports coming from around the world. How do we follow up unless we have translators and an open government policy around the world where people feel that they can report honestly what they've encountered without some sort of retribution by the government, which is distinctly the way it is working in the United States, or criticism from fellow human beings? Humans are more afraid of ridicule and criticism from humans than they are of non-humans.
Can I just
You're absolutely right.
Can I make a point that I made in my presentation, which sort of sums this up? The problem is the coverage. It's not how many sightings there are. The more people are covering it, the more sightings you're going to get. Basically, it comes down to the story of Chase Brandon. Chase Brandon was identified himself as the second most powerful person in the CIA outside the director to speak publicly on behalf of the CIA. He was the liaison for CIA to Hollywood. He could speak publicly on behalf of the CIA. He comes out in front of 2 million people and says, I saw the files, I saw a box, Roswell was real, there was aliens, this is for real, and nobody covered the story. It's as simple as that. It's just not being covered.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I had anticipated, most of my questions have been asked. There was lots of discussion on why a cover-up. Congressman Cook asked a question. There wasn't a lengthy discussion of it, and that is, there have been a number of sightings before anybody had an airplane or a lighter-than aircraft in the air, and I think that people need to understand that this is not just a current day. As our technology to develop, the sightings become more frequent, but there have been sightings way back in history. Am I not correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yes.
Okay.
fine book
I just wanted that
Saucers and the
to be
Bible.
on the record. By the way, extraterrestrials are not anti-biblical. If you read the book of Job, you should expect them. Maybe they can't get here, but they sure got to heaven as far as the book of Job is concerned. You can read about them there. The one question I had which wasn't answered, and I would like, you don't have to give an answer now because time's up, but I would like for the record for you to tell us how many unexplained sightings out there. Now, lots of these things can be kind of wished away and explained away. Two people that get on a craft, they could have rehearsed their lie so that they now, under hypnotism, tell you the same lie. You know, but there are some things that just can't be explained away. How many sightings have there been, unexplained sightings, that have been accompanied by radar? Sightings are easy, lights on clouds and so forth, and that can behave in very erratic ways. But, you know, how many of these sightings have been accompanied by radar tracks? If you could provide that from the record, it's not just a few, I understand, it's a great many of those. But I think the public would be very interested in how many unexplained sightings out there have been accompanied by radar where these objects were doing things that no known earthcraft can do. You can provide that for the record?
We can try.
We don't know, and we also know that such reports are carefully covered up, to use the expression.
But I've seen some reference to those things. Do the best you can, because I think the public would like to know.
Of publicly known, there have to be more than 100, probably several hundred, if we were to tally them together. And there presumably are many that just are classified. But there are quite a few that we do know about that have been declassified or that came out one way or another. There's quite a few.
Yes.
I don't know about thousands, but
if you could give some indication, it's not just one or two.
No.
No. Some indication so that the public can know how many of those. This has been a very interesting hearing. Thank you very much. The hearing will now stand in brief recess. Thank you very much.